Everybody. Thanks for joining us for what is episode 3 of our series from Axonify, New Answers to Old L&D Questions. Today we're talking about how can I modernize my learning technology ecosystem. So for those who haven't joined our series before, this is a little bit different than a traditional webinar. No real presentation, almost no slides, just some slides on screen to keep you up to on pace with where we are in our conversation. We're not recording for sharing with everybody out there. We're really focused on the conversation. So both conversation between myself as your host and our guest, as well as everyone here joining us today. So in the WebEx panel, you should see a question and answer area at any point. Feel free to drop a question so you can join into the conversation, help direct our conversation as we explore all things learning technology. So a quick introduction for myself. I'm your host. I'm JD, the Chief Learning Architect from Axonify. Axonify is a learning technology company that focuses especially on the needs of the frontline workforce, a particularly challenging environment that we see right now, given all things going on in our world. So our real focus is, again, enabling the frontline associate. So I spent a lot of my time in learning technology, specifically, again, focused on how we can enable frontline employees. And when it comes to learning technology, or exploring or diving into, what does the marketplace really look like? How can we answer questions? How can we find the right things that we need? What does all of this stuff mean? I decided to invite a person who I've seen exploring the learning technology conversation in a particularly unique and particularly public way over the course of the last several months. So rather than do the introduction myself, I'll let our guest introduce himself. How are you doing, sir? Who are you? What do you do? And why do you talk learning?
Who am I? That's a big question, JD. I don't know if we have enough time.
Surface level.
Just surface level. Yeah, so I'm Christopher Lind. I head up global digital learning for GE Healthcare. That is my day-to-day focus. And then as JD mentioned, at the end of last year, started a particularly public live stream where I sit down with great companies like JD and Axonify to talk about what is this tech? How does this tech work? How do you use it and how do you make the most of it? So yeah, that's something I've been doing now for a bit on top of everything else. So thanks for reaching out. It's fun to chat again.
Yeah, thanks for hanging out with us and for kind of allowing us to flip the script a little bit in terms of, you asked me questions specifically about what we do at Axonify. Now I get to ask you questions about everything that you're learning as you interact with various different folks that interact or kind of provide technology to the corporate learning space. So our overall conversation today, again, focused on how to modernize and make better decisions around learning technology. We are also joined by our producer, Jackie, who is fielding all of your questions in the question and answer section of WebEx. I'll make sure to pause throughout our conversation to see what types of questions are coming out there so we can direct the conversation in a way that's most beneficial to you. In the meantime, I've got some starter questions that we crowdsourced to start generating our conversation, and we're also going to play a game because if this is a talk show, and as you've seen, a lot of talk shows are now lighting up from home, to be a talk show, I think you have to play a game somewhere in the middle. So we're also going to play a game while we're here to make it as exciting and engaging as possible. So let's start the conversation with really the big question when it comes to learning technology. Why is this so hard? So why is it, do you think, in your kind of exploration and all your conversations, why is it so challenging for people to figure out kind of what's going on, what to pay attention to, kind of cut through the noise that is kind of corporate learning tech?
So I'll be interested. I want to flip this back on you because on the vendor side, I'd love to hear your take on it. But on my end, the way I look at it, I think there's a couple variables that are really impacting. I don't think there's just a simple answer. I mean, fundamentally, right, the biggest challenge I see is nobody likes change, right? Nobody likes change. And this is fundamentally, learning technology is really fundamentally different than how many of us have viewed learning, how many of us have engaged with learning, how many of us have designed it. So, right, it's a different way of doing things. And anytime anything's different, there's some resistance to it. So you have that. You've got this underlying anchor just kind of holding people back a little bit. I think something else that I've seen just in not only talking with tech providers, but with a lot of practitioners is there is L&D did not historically attract tech people, right? That wasn't, if you were a tech head, you didn't necessarily think I'm going to go into L&D. You went into L&D because you were a dynamic facilitator. You loved working with people, things like that. And so the skill set that historically drew people into L&D, now that skill set's changing a bit. Now, the other thing that I am very empathetic to people is that it is complicated and it is changing very quickly. And I think those are two variables that have really historically blown the lid off some of this stuff, is the fact that, you know, you used to be like, okay, when you were exploring learning tech, it was a discussion around what LMS do we buy? And, you know, maybe do we need another supplemental reinforcement platform? Now that conversation has turned into, well, okay, we need to create digital experience. We need we need an aggregator for all our content. We need something to do data analytics and visualization while still the complexity of that has grown significantly and at a pace that is historically unfounded. So I think, you know, you combine all those things together, you're seeing really just a crock pot of things that creates some chaos. But how about what do you see when you talk to other people?
Yeah, I think you hit a lot of the notes. I think one of the places I start, so most of my career has been spent in corporate learning and operations roles, right? So I came out of the application side of learning technology. At one point was an e-learning developer, LMS administrator, over the years owned kind of the learning tech stack in different organizations. Simply put, I didn't usually have a great experience. So I think there's a lot of disappointment in the marketplace when it comes to the potential for certain types of technology and then what actually happens. And I don't think that's limited to learning technology. I think that's kind of a workplace technology theme, but I think that challenges us in fundamental ways. You know, if you've been disappointed by a partner or vendor in the past, your desire to do it again or to put risk out there, and especially the amount of effort and resource required in a lot of cases to stand up technology inside of an organization with all of the different stakeholders and red tape and process, and it requires a lot in a lot of cases. So if you've had a negative experience in the past, I think it can often turn you off to or make you risk averse, where maybe you then stay with a certain technology as opposed to explore new ideas. Another thing I think stands out big to me is that I think some cases we can get comfortable with the way that we do what we do or the way we approach our work, and then our technology decisions kind of reflect that comfort, where you might make iterative changes that become more about features and less about evolving the way that you do what you do. Because evolving the way you approach your work and then bringing that to life through technology is, again, a bigger conversation than saying, I want to go from this platform that does 5 things to this platform that does the same 5 things the same way, but also has a 6th thing. Right? So if you're making that kind of an iterative feature-based change, I don't think you're looking wide enough at the whole picture of what technology could do for you and the people you support in your organization. And I think that slows us down, because I think what I've seen, working with or talking to people from a variety of different industries and use cases, the speed with which thought leadership, have to air quote anytime I say those words, the speed of thought leadership and as a result kind of technology development and investment in our space moves a lot faster than that kind of day-to-day reality of how can we take advantage of those things. And then, oh, by the way, everyone in corporate learning, or yourself included, you have jobs. So how much time and effort do you have dedicated to keeping up with things that are moving so quickly, to figure out that how do they attach to what I'm doing, and then how do I make informed decisions as a result? So for me, I think it's everything you said, and then some of those additional pieces kind of snapped all together, like you said. I don't think there's
and that's just it, right? There's so many variables that, and that's where I completely recognize this isn't easy. And I think sometimes it's easy, and when I talk to some folks, they look at, right, the folks that, at least on paper, are doing everything and go, we're so far from that. And the reality is most people aren't there. And it's about, like, what is your process to move things forward? So, I think to do that, though, Teddy asked a good question, which is, it's the skill set piece. It goes back to, right, this fear of, like, okay, how do I work in this new world? I think one of the challenges that, and I take this very personally, and I try and do this with other senior learning leaders, is, we really need to help our organizations understand, and we need to deconstruct the work of what happens in L&D and figure out what the real skills are, so we can help our teams understand this is how you operate in this new world. Because honestly, when you really deconstruct it, the skills of old L&D and the skills of new L&D, when done well at least, they're transferable, but you need somebody to help paint the picture of, hey, okay, this is what you're really good at. This is how you take, here's how you're going to, use that skill maybe in a different way. And I think that can help, at least in my experience, it's helped with my teams where, they're kind of looking at things going, I'm nervous about this new world. How do we work through that resistance to change?
And so many of the conversations I have that are about, or at least start about technology, revert to being about mindset, right? The way that we think about
100%.
what we do and the role that we play in helping an individual and organization perform, and then insert, okay, if we think about what we do and we advance our practices, then how does technology bring that to life and help us scale, get faster, personalize, whatever the things that technology can help us do. But it's not about getting anytime anyone leads with technology, we know what happens to that type of conversation. So I tend to, so many things I talk about in this space start with mindset, even
It's mindset.
content, technology. It all comes back to rethinking what we do in the kind of current context of the world, our organization, what problems we're trying to solve, and then backing into what are the right tools and tactics to get there. And for me, that leads to better decision making and asking better questions. And I'd love to say, like, I was always thinking that way. No, no, I did not
No,
sit back
it's
in a
a
chair and
journey.
go, I'm thinking about this the wrong way.
Right. No.
For me, I don't know if the same for you. For me, it entirely comes out of just kind of struggling to figure it out and being challenged and having to overcome challenges because you just simply can't do things the way you were doing it before, right? When I worked at Disney, I was mostly instructor-led activity. We didn't do a whole lot of digital stuff. Then I went to a contact center environment where we had to I had to flip around and figure out how to live in the reality of a contact center. And then the business changed around me. And I realized I just couldn't do things the way I was doing it anymore. And that shoved me kind of out of my comfort zone to say, figure it out. And that opened the door for me to have different types of conversations and ask different questions about different types of technology that I wouldn't have had if that situation didn't come up for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I look back earlier in my career, for me, it was some of the things I don't really take no or we can't well, right? I just don't take that well if I feel like we haven't really tested that first. And so even in my early days, where it was like, well, no, this is how we train our customers. Like, no, like we're saying that based on strictly that's how we've been doing it. And I think that mantra has continued to kind of bleed through, my messaging to teams, things like that. Is like, let's stop asking how can we do what we're doing better? And let's say if we could do anything, how would we do it? And then once we define those problems and those capabilities, then we can back into it and start saying, well, okay, here are some limitations we either can't work around or things like that. But when you kind of start, like you said, with that mindset first, everything becomes that much easier.
Yeah, I think the one other big thing that I always challenge people when it comes to learning technology is that it doesn't have to be called a learning technology
No,
to help you solve problems related to learning and performance at work.
no,
And that, again, just swings the door open to, we started here. Really, we're playing in a field that's this wide. Some tailored pieces of technology that are specifically designed to do certain things, great. But there's other things at play. Whenever I walk into an organization, I want to know things like, I want to know the entire tool set that an employee is using in order to do their job, and then connect that to my ability to help them do their job, not just say, which LMS do you have? Because
right,
the reality is that's probably a very small percent of a person's average working day with technology. Meanwhile, they're using a collaboration tool or an intranet or a POS system or this, that, the other, which maybe I don't have the tools and resources to, build the perfect combination of platforms,
yep.
but I need to make decisions with an understanding of the whole picture, not just what's the one thing we're looking to replace or
Right.
augment.
Right. What's the buzz or what's the company in our space? And I mean, Holly asked about that, right? She asked, what's in scope for learning tech? And I think it's any technology that's being used in our organizations by people to get their work done, right? Is it, what are those tools? Because there are capabilities that a lot of times you do have to explore. And I've been part of more projects than I'd like to admit where you fall into this trap, right? You get into your L&D silo and you think we've got the better mousetrap, and so we're going to make that mousetrap work when it's like, well, but maybe that capability exists somewhere else. And if you can tap into that because people are already using it, well, then so be it. Figure out how to maximize that. So I think it's a great point.
Yeah, the one ring to rule them all does not exist,
No.
regardless of who we're talking about. At work is just, I would challenge anyone here to say, do you use one application to do your job? If so, which one and why don't I have it? We live in, even on your phone, I often challenge people when I start talking about learning tech, ask how many apps do you have on your phone? And no one has ever said one. And I said,
Nobody
well,
ever said, I wish I had just one.
no,
Nobody
right?
said that because they know that it's not what you would actually want.
Yeah, because if you did lean on, maybe you're leaning on one particular application, do 15 different things, the odds are that there's another one tool coming that's going to do some of those things better. And in order to evolve with the time, you need to be agile in that regard and not locked into the, well, I have one learning management system and that is how we do learning here, because it's just not how people behave with technology in their everyday lives, yet alone in their workplace. So I'll pause for a second to throw to Jackie. Jackie, any questions standing out from the folks that have joined us today that we should dive into?
Well, you guys have done a great job with keeping up with the questions that we have. We got one more coming in from Teddy that says, my frustration is that I want to use more tech, laptops, videos, short lessons, but our environment doesn't lend itself to that. Most of our frontline workers are in manufacturing.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
So I'll throw that to you, Chris. So how would you look at that type of a situation?
So I've been in a number of different industries, number of different sectors, and there's always that challenge, right? Regardless of what environment, right? There's going to be components of the best experience that are going to be limited, and quite frankly, right, it's why I don't have hair. It's because some of it is literally just being relentless of seeking out opportunities where you can do it and not get too caught up in how can we get our whole strategy to shift to that, right? How do we move everything over there and say, okay, if we're trying to do more things with smaller chunks of content, or we're trying to do more around performance support or collaboration, let's not try and change everything in our operation to do that, but let's find some strategic opportunities where there might be something we can tap into, and just don't quit. Because I will tell you, I've been kicked in the teeth so many times where it's like, okay, we're going to try this. And it's just like, nope. You're like, okay, how about this? Nope. And it's maybe sounds discouraging. And that's where it does take a bit of relentless passion to be like, we're just going to keep trying until something sticks.
Yeah, and I kind of add on to that. I think it comes back to that idea of focusing on the problems we're trying to solve and how technology can help us enable that, right? Generally speaking, the problem statement shouldn't be help people learn, right? It's we're going to try to help people overcome a performance challenge or build something into their work process that helps them build better habits in certain areas, solve different types of challenges, expedite the way we can get information to a particular audience, and then backing into, okay, what are our opportunities and the value that technology could bring to this conversation. So as a team, again, that specializes in frontline environments, it often requires kind of connecting that problem statement, again, to the context of what it's like to be a person who works in this environment every day, and then assessing everything about that experience in terms of where people spend their time, what tools and technologies they already use, and where's the kind of the moment. Where do they have a couple of minutes in their day, as it were, to be able to access, or where do these problems arise, or where do they get questions asked of them that they would need to be able to access information in those moments? And the answer changes depending on the organization, the workplace, even in the same industry. The answer may not be the same. So in certain logistics environments, my team has moved technology in a warehouse setting to position it closer to where these moments arise. The one I often reference is that we were looking at forklift drivers. And the question was, well, how do we reinforce the right behaviors when it comes to safety for a forklift driver? They spend most of their day driving a forklift. You can't do that while you're driving a forklift. So we said, well, we looked at their workflow and said, well, there's a natural stopping point in their day because they have to recharge their forklift or their lift truck, depending on the terminology you use. I often get corrected with lift truck. So we said, well, can we position technology close to that charging station? So this is our opportunity to reach people with reinforcement and practice activities and these types of things. And we actually, in some cases, move, some of the oldest PCs you've ever seen can be used to do these types of things. There's a lot of grocery stores out there where we've moved their existing, training computer from that second floor office that no one ever goes to like right next to a time clock or into a break room or behind a particular department's desk, because these are the moments or the places where they have moments of opportunity for training, or they have to look up a piece of information to solve a guest question. So it's really taking a look at the environment and figuring out what's technology going to do to help me enable people in this environment, and then making the right decisions there that fit within the workday, generally speaking.
Well, and I would add with that is the fact that, so I've had a little bit of a unique background in that I actually haven't been in HR, right? I've always been ops, like in some sort of operational capacity. And the point you talked about, I think, is one that all of us in learning can get really good at is, stripping the learning vocab from our vernacular when we're talking with our business leaders about what we're trying to do. And instead of kind of having the conversation around, well, we want to do more micro learning, or we want to do more performance support. Our business leaders, they don't understand what that means. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Sounds good, or maybe doesn't sound good based on their perception of things. And, when you can deconstruct the work and say, we want to be able to help people do more of this, and it's a pain point that's in that business leader's things, you'll see the purse strings open up, right? I mean, they will open up when you can actually show that you're solving a pain point. As one example, with one organization, we were having a massive issue with the way we used Salesforce. Massive issues. We needed more data in Salesforce, and we just couldn't get people to do it. And I could have approached it from we want to do an NLP experiment with, machine learning. And it was like, okay, would have gone right over. And instead it was talking about the fact that these people were in their cars, they aren't at laptops. How do we get them to put that data in Salesforce? And so we ended up doing an NLP project through Alexa, but because of that. And it wasn't because I was, blew them away with really cool learning slides. It was because I was solving a pain point that they were losing sleep over.
Yeah, someone who came out of contact centers, nothing creates a barrier quicker than saying to a contact center operations team, we want to do more training on.
Oh.
But then
right.
You completely restate what you're about to do to say, we want to help you solve the problem you already have and is already a big priority for you. Do it in a non-disruptive way that keeps people on the phone.
Yep. Exactly.
I've never had anyone argue against me with that point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You're not going to get that. I don't think there's time for that, or I don't think we have capacity. Then it turns into how do we do that? Let's have that conversation.
Right. So I want to dig into some of the conversations you've been having. So how many episodes of Learning Tech Talk have you done so far?
Oh gosh, 30.
Tracking? There's not like 100 episode celebration coming up?
I'm tracking by dates, right? I kicked it off in October of last year, so I'll know when the 1-year anniversary comes. It's been a good 30 or 40 so far.
So I'm curious, in all these conversations about technology with different providers and whatnot, are there any particular topics, features, trends, certain things that you see keep coming up that learning technology companies are really focused on or talking a lot about?
What's been interesting about it is the more I talk to different folks, the more you see the diversification of things, right? There's this big debate around like, are we moving more towards like the one solution to simplify the ecosystem? And really the trend I'm seeing is no, actually, I would say there's greater complexity coming in not to the end user, but to the architect on the back end to say, okay, what do these tools do? How do you need it to work? Because sometimes people have been like, well, what's your opinion on this platform? And my answer is usually, well, I don't know. What are you trying to do? Because depending on what you're trying to do, that platform may be phenomenal. If you're trying to do this, I would never say use that platform. It's like recommending using, a hammer to drill a hole in wood. It's just not the right tool. There are some trends that, I'm seeing continuing to emerge. I think there is a lot of emphasis heavily still on the best way to contextualize content, right? How do we get better at giving people relevant information where they are when they need it, right? That continues to be a trend that I think we're in. How people are doing that is very different. I see a lot of different ways people are trying to bring that together. But again, that's kind of a universal, hey, we have a lot of stuff. People need stuff, but we have so much stuff it's confusing. So how do we try and simplify and make sure we're delivering that to them? Another big one that seems to be really kind of rising to the top is the analytics behind this stuff. Now, where I think, and I know Axonify is one that's diving into that space very heavily. One of the things that I think as L&D leaders we need to continue looking at is that just like technology isn't a solution to our problems, neither is data and analytics. So just because we all of a sudden start having tons of data and analytics, that's not necessarily, we might have really fancy dashboards and cool ways of doing it, but we still need to think strategically about what are we doing with that data and analytics. But that data and analytics is becoming almost more of a table stakes where it's like, we need to see more than completion data and, records of attendance. We need to see more of that. And I think that's, something that's really surfacing. The third one, lots of places going towards how do we go beyond content and focus on bringing experiences to people, right? And whether that's virtual experiences, whether it's VR experiences, whether it's AR experiences, things like that, where it's like, how are we actually helping people through the work or actually get better at the behaviors versus just telling them what good behaviors look like is another one. And then I guess the fourth one that I would say overall continues to be there is the whole skill piece, right? How do we really help organizations understand what all this stuff means? And I think that's going back to a huge trend, which is learning is really starting to be more integrated into talent and operations versus being seen as this silo organization that's kind of a content creation shop. So that's kind of my high level takeaways.
Awesome. Let's use that as a transition point into our game for today's episode.
Okay.
Today's game is called Do I Need An? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw different types of learning technology categories at you. Okay. And what I need you to do as quickly as possible, there's no timer, we've got time, but as quickly as possible, talk me through how you would assess the need for a particular type of technology in an organization. Obviously, we don't know, I'm not talking about specific context or specific type of industry or anything like that. But if you were a person who's sitting there at home right now saying, do I need one of these things? Yep. What would you say that they should be thinking about, questions they should be asking themselves, the organization, to understand, is this a potential value add to their technology stack in their organization? All right, ready to go.
Here we go. Rapid fire.
Here we go. There are no prizes. There are no write-ups.
A digital high five. That's what we'll get.
There it is. Appropriate for every reason.
Right. Oh, actually, elbow bump maybe.
That's a better acting as a better role model. Do I need an LMS?
So some of the first questions that I get, when I ask this is one, where are you on a maturity level from learning and development, right? I think for many organizations, L&D, an LMS will remain a staple for record keeping and things like that. I think one of the biggest questions that I usually try and dig into with this is what kind of regulatory requirements do you have for maintaining this stuff? I mean, this is one thing LMSs do really well is keep secure records of training data. And I think that's one thing that, will they play a role in things? Yes. The question of, do you have to have an LMS? I think that answer anymore is maybe not. But I think, those are some of the early things. And again, it's one of those, what are you really trying to do? Are you trying to manage a lot of classroom sessions? Do you just have real fundamental digital content? And that goes back to, where are you on the L&D maturity scale?
Yeah, awesome. Great answer. Let's move forward to, do I need a social learning platform?
Oh, wow. Social learning platform. With this one, the where are you on the L&D maturity scale is a big one, because if you're very early in L&D maturity in terms of not only just technology, but even just the way you operate, if you're a push down type organization, you are going to struggle with a social learning platform, right? Because culturally, this is not where people are digging into. They're not used to this. Your own organization is going to struggle with figuring out how to do this. And these are a lot of work to make successful. At least that's been my experience and what I've seen with others. Now, that's not to say that there's not a place, but sometimes my question back to this is, do you really need a separate social learning platform for this type of stuff? Or to our earlier conversation, are some of the systems in place that you're using where people are collaborating now? Would you be better spent trying to use what you have and tapping into those networks versus trying to create yet another place where you're asking people to go collaborate on corporate L&D?
Yeah, I often, to kind of echo that same sentiment, I would ask people, how much do they understand about how information is shared inside of their organization and the role that that plays in helping people do their jobs, and what we're trying to accomplish as related to that. I find a lot of people, we get very enamored with, and I think it informs this whole conversation, consumer tech, right? There are things that we liked and we use them to solve problems in everyday life. And we try to port those same types of ideas across to the workplace. And I think I just explained why Yammer ever existed, right? But the question is, how many of those behaviors actually translate, and how do people naturally behave when it comes to sharing? And what's the right place to enable that type of engagement, collaboration, and sharing of information, as opposed to calling it social learning, which is where I struggle with the topic in that regard.
Well, and social learning, right? Going back to the Yammer discussion, and this is the other thing, is there's a misperception, I think, with social learning, that it's like that's something you like put out there and then people just do it, right? Because naturally people love just putting themselves out there and doing that. And it's like that's not natural human behavior. So you can't underestimate the amount of effort you're going to have to put in to driving that forward. I've used Yammer and other social platforms very successfully, but it was a lot of work on our end because that became our communication channel. It was like, well, you're in this onboarding cohort. This is how we're managing you through that so you can collaborate. But I mean, they didn't just do it on their own. Like this idea that, oh, organic discussion will spring up and people will just post videos of them sharing best practices. It's like not by itself.
Yeah, I always refer to there's that general 99.1% principle of how people share on the internet, and it's even more magnified in the workplace, where there's that 1% of people who love sharing really ugly PowerPoint presentations that they made that people actually find of high value, but most of the workplace is the 90%. I just need what I need in order to solve my problem. Yeah,
they're the stalkers. They're watching, they're consuming, and I've seen Yammer be an amazing. Right, that's fine, but you have to recognize you've got that variability, and you better be ready to be that 1% on steroids.
Exactly. All right. Do I need, and let me see where my mouse is. There it is. Do I need a VR?
Oh, so my first question with this one back to people is, what do you mean when you say VR? Because I think this is where the lines are blurring a little bit. I think a lot of people look at VR as just, immersive tech, right? Haptics, that kind of stuff. And to that, I would say, well, do you really have like safety or, really immersive type? Are you training pilots or, operators on heavy equipment where it's dangerous to actually have them practice their behavior? I don't want somebody driving a D8 through the corporate headquarters. That type of stuff, you might say, okay, you've got some real opportunity to incorporate the traditional VR. I think where this question is becoming more of an opportunity to say there may be some broader implications of this is, are there situations where you're trying to put people in environments that you can't quite replicate or you wouldn't want to replicate in real life? And that doesn't mean you have to put haptic gear on. That could mean you're creating a virtual environment on a desktop or on a mobile phone, but at least you're trying to create something separate. And I think when that discussion starts happening, that's where you'll find some opportunities. I think it has potential when used very carefully. Do I see it being this massive trend of like everybody's going to get, Oculus Rifts in onboarding? I don't.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. The only thing I would also add is sometimes and this has nothing to do with the current state of affairs, but I used to manage VR-based attractions back in the day. in theme parks, and just what it takes to maintain the equipment,
Yes.
especially from a cleanliness perspective, was another thing that just kind of gets in the back of my head, in addition to everything you said about the value of immersive environment, because we can't do it for whatever reason, and it is the best option to help us solve whatever particular challenge we're facing.
Well, and the other thing you bring on that VR, I was having a discussion about this with someone else, and the topic of, right, some people, that's a very uncomfortable feeling, right, to not know what's around them, and that's a safety, thing that you really have to be careful with. So it's not just there's a lot of reasons why you have to tread this one carefully.
And some people just can't do it at all, right? So I think there's an accessibility layer on top of any conversation when it comes to resources, content, technology. So I think that's another thing just be generally aware of.
Some of the cool ones, though, some of the best ones I've seen is where it's a combination of VR in reality, right? Where you've seen people do things that it's like, wow, you've combined the two to really solve a problem. So mixed reality, yeah.
Exactly. All right. Do I need an LRS, learning record store?
Ooh, this one, so this again goes back to a misconception I think a lot of people have about the LRS. I think initially when people think about, an LRS, they immediately jump to like, oh, you mean like Watershed or Learning Locker. And really there's a lot of LMSs that have an LRS on the back end. You just don't really see it. So the bigger question comes to, one, are you sure you don't already have one? Two, what type of need are you trying to get into, right? Are you trying to pull data and business intelligence from multiple systems into a central repository where you can start to analyze, and do things with that data? An LRS is not a tool for a junior L&D organization. And I think that's one of those things where it's like, on a maturity scale, you need to have a lot of ducks in order to really start maximizing the value of something like this in the state that I think a lot of people have. And I think that's one of those, your organization better be ready, and you better be ready to know how you're going to use it, or it's going to gather some virtual dust.
Yeah, and one of the things I said back when that kind of experience API conversation began was, what's the best way for us to manage data and share data inside of this organization, given the tools that we have and the data that we're going to need to ask questions and solve problems, right? And I think the reality is you need to look at the larger picture of data in your organization to then understand the right way for your learning technologies to work with that data. It may be related to a learning record store and Next API, or it may not be, right? So I don't, this category should not be directly connected to advancing with data. I need to have a ...
Correct.
It's more about looking at your kind of how data is used today. And this is another great place where I think a great recommendation comes to working with partners in your organization who have domain mastery, because usually the best data person in your company doesn't work for L&D.
No, they don't.
That person may be able to answer this question with you, because they might have alternatives or different types of tools that you can work with, as opposed to having to do, again, something on your own.
And that goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is, instead of saying, do we need this type of acronym, it's more of what capability are you looking for? And you can't have that conversation till you've met with the people who really own the data and manage the data in your organization, to say, what can't we do today that we want to be able to do? And is there a way we can do it? And if not, then we can start having that exploration.
You almost gave away the whole game right there, which is you almost should never ask the question, do I need to insert category of technology here? It comes back to problems you're trying to solve, the context you're trying to solve it with. But for the sake of today, we're starting with the wrong question.
Keep going.
Do I need mobile learning?
So with this one, I feel like that's saying, do I need internet? Right? It's one of those things where it's just like, in today's world, 5, 10, maybe, years ago, you might have said, well, we need to design, a mobile solution and a desktop solution. And today anymore, it should be, why are you should be asking yourself, why are we asking the question of, do we need mobile learning? That should just be we should be able to seamlessly flip a switch. Anything we do on desktop should seamlessly transition, especially with the tools out there now. And not to say, well, if you're not doing that, you're bad. It's like, no, some people are still on that journey. But I think it's less of a, do we do mobile learning, and more of a, well, mobile learning is an expectation of people anymore. They just expect they can do things on mobile.
How close would you say in your conversations we are to this type of a question just being table stakes? This is just something that's part of our story, and we don't have to say mobile learning anymore?
I would say we're getting there. The technology is getting us there in many ways. I think you used to always have to ask the question, like, do you have a mobile app? Right? Anymore, that's a question that if anybody says no, it's just like, what? Why? And you may want to reconsider what you're exploring.
Other questions now. Other questions.
Right. Like,
yeah.
let's ask a whole lot of other questions. So I think we're getting a lot closer to it. Where I see this as still an opportunity is I think internally, we still, from a mindset standpoint, aren't designing this way. We aren't designing solutions to be like, look, whether somebody's sitting at their computer, in their car, in a classroom, like this should just be a seamless experience. And I think until we really make that shift, the tech's definitely there in most ways. I think it's our ability to execute against that.
Yep, I was working with a kind of a demonstration course from another learning technology company recently, just to see what it looked like. And I had my phone upright, and it didn't look like I couldn't interact with the content correctly. And I expected just going to landscape and be like, "Oh, this is going to fix it," and it didn't. I was like, "Wait a minute, this isn't how technology works. It should just work with my phone, right? It should just be responsive in that way." So I'm very hopeful that we're getting close to a point where we don't have to separate, because I think we put too many things in boxes in this industry. And I think this is one of those boxes where it shouldn't be about the technology you need to do it. It should just be about the context of the person you're trying to support, the technology that they use. And even there may be plenty of examples where the person and the context aren't mobile, but the device is.
Yes.
Right? Maybe they're in a store and they're completing their digital training in a store, but the technology used in the store is a tablet.
Right.
So all the concepts apply, just in a different context. So it shouldn't really matter, like you said at that point. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Do I need adaptive learning?
Oh, so with this one, I really think the answer to this, and I know that I know I always say, well, it just kind of depends. This is one that I think everybody needs to be really thinking about. And I would say if this isn't something you're thinking about, it should. And the reason I say that is there haven't been a ton of what I would say transformational innovations in learning in a long time, right? And when I look at adaptive and the fact that we're getting to a point where we truly can contextualize things and say, listen, if you don't need this information because you already have that, why would we punish you and force you to go through that? And to me, that's where, why wouldn't we want to get to that point? And I think one of the challenges we have here is the mindset piece, right? There's this kind of like, well, we made this stuff. We want to make sure everybody sees it. And it's like, well, why though? Because if they don't need it, this is a fantastic way to say, let's make sure people have what they need. So do you need to go buy an adaptive learning platform out of the gate? That I wouldn't just have a universal, yes, everyone sign up, go do it. But what I say, should everyone be considering how do we move to a more adaptive approach in learning? Hands down, yes.
Yep, agreed. Last one. It's the big one. Are you ready? Do you need to take a sip of beverage before we get to this one? So the biggest kind of trendy topic in learning and development right now, do I need an LXP?
Do you need an LXP? You know what's funny about this is this acronym has been so just like blown up. It doesn't, in my opinion, in some regards, it doesn't even mean anything anymore, because like SharePoint can be an LXP, by its most fundamental definition. When I think of LXP, right, do you need an LXP as an organization? I think that question really boils down to, you really need to start looking at, one, how are you managing your talent data in an organization at an enterprise level, right? Are you looking at this at an enterprise level? Are you trying to pull together content from all over the place? Are you really trying to do more of a integrated talent management approach? Then that conversation may start to lead you more towards okay, maybe this type of, massive enterprise kind of capability is something we should at least be exploring. Does everybody need to run out and buy an LXP because it's a cool front on the way people consume learning? I would say no, because when you think about it, going back to in many cases, some of these things are still built on the assumption your employees want one place to go to consume all their learning. And the reality is they probably don't. That's probably not a big problem we're trying to solve. So I think this is one where it's a trend. I see why it's a trend. I definitely see opportunity for them. Is it something like an LMS that everybody just should universally have on their roadmap? No.
And if we had another hour, we could go off the rails with regards to my opinion of the Netflix of learning analogy, and why that should never be uttered again, and why it just doesn't match what we do for a living. Because I, generally speaking, want to have as little contact with a person as possible in order to help them do as great a job as they possibly can, as opposed to say, please binge watch as much training content as you can possibly consume. So yeah, I think there's this the learning experience platform category is fraught with analogies and features.
It is. And that's where I think what gets very difficult is a lot of people are tacking LXP to their thing. And so this is one of the spaces that's very diluted, right? Where you're hearing, oh, we're an LXP, and you're like, you're an LXP, so you do this stuff, and it's like, oh, well, no, we do this, and you're like, okay, so how are you, but when you just say learning experience platform, it's like, well, you experience learning through Google. So Google's a learning experience platform in that sense. So yeah.
At least when you come down to kind of the terms and the acronyms and the abbreviations, at least learning management system has that, like you said, compliance record keeping feel to it.
Exactly.
Where in
some of the other
ones,
did people do the thing that we assigned them to do? I get it. So
yeah. All right, so that was our game, Do I Need An? So round of applause from the audience.
Virtual applause. Come on,
taking place at home.
WebEx.
So as we get into about 10 minutes or so left, I want to throw back to Jackie. Jackie, any questions coming up from our audience that we should dive into with our remaining time?
We have 2 comments from people in the chat. One is James, who says, I see a value of mixed reality in onboarding, mobile apps that communicate with signs, posts in a new place of employment. And then Teddy, who talks about having regulatory bodies that dictate what we have to cover. And he struggles with how adaptive you can be in an environment like that.
So I'll jump on both of those and feel free to jump back to JD. So, for James, I agree with you on the value of this. I did something with this almost a decade ago with QR technology for onboarding, and it was very powerful, right? It allowed us to create a very cool, seamless experience for new hires without having to push content. So I think there's tremendous potential there, and AR, VR, whatever R you want to tack along with it, depending on how you do it, I think there's definitely potential. To your question, Teddy, about the regulatory bodies. So I can tell you, I was with one organization in a business function that was, you want to call regulated. It was more than that. And I will tell you, there's a fine line you have to walk when you're dealing with the regulatory bodies, because there's a lot of times regulations are used by people as a way of saying no, because they don't really necessarily want to explore but how could we do it, right? And so finding your way to navigate some of those things, because I recognize there was one I was dealing with FDA on, well, people have to consume X number of hours of training on this thing. And we had a very candid discussion around, but what if instead of demonstrating compliance to a number, we could demonstrate competence to the things you actually are concerned about as a regulatory body, right? It's about talking to their pain point and saying, I know the reason this regulation exists is because you're concerned people are going to do this because they don't know this. I have a better way to help demonstrate this in a much more meaningful way. And that opens the door. I won't promise you that every time you have that conversation, they'll just lean over and go, great, okay, fine, you're good. But I've had success with that in the past, but it's definitely a delicate balancing act, navigating that. And it really goes back to being able to address what pain are they trying to mitigate through regulation, and how can you mitigate that better than their suggestion.
Couldn't have said that better. So I had very similar experiences myself. So asking that question with regards to what's the problem we're actually trying to solve? What's the risk we're trying to mitigate? And the other thing I would add is, are there layers to this requirement that have been added internally over time based on past practice, where usually there's a regulator that says this is the rule, and then oftentimes internal legal and compliance stack on to the rule, and they do it based on what was possible at that time in order to solve the problem, not with an understanding of what's possible today. So sometimes those challenging questions can lead to revelations you didn't necessarily know.
It's not easy, right? Like, it's not like you just have one conversation and go, hey, adaptive learning can do it this way. And everybody, all your legal teams and the regulatory bodies just go, wow, thanks. It's a lot of conversations. You really have to be prepared to in some cases go to battle, because again, it's work for some of these people, because now you're asking them to relook at the regulation or the way they've done it and reevaluate their take on it. And so it's not easy, but it can be done.
And sometimes you have to demonstrate your capability to solve the problem in a different way with a maybe lower risk item or something that they already value and understand. So you can then turn around and say, look what we did, not here's my idea.
Yes.
And then they can grab a hold of that, as opposed to, well, the learning guy must know, which is not
right. A lot of times we don't have that kind of credibility in organizations where we can just come in with a really cool concept and everybody just says, great, let's do it.
All right, so we got just a couple minutes left. I'm going to borrow a couple of minutes for some free advice, if you don't mind. So in the way that you're chatting with a lot of technology providers in the space, I'm curious what your thoughts are for, again, the general learning technology community. What could we be doing better as providers to keep people informed, to educate people with regards to what's possible, the type of work we're doing, what platforms actually do in real life? What are you seeing that we could be doing better as providers?
I think one of the things that certain organizations are doing a good job, I think this is an example of one of them, right, is customer education. And I think one of the areas that we can get better at it, we need to not just educate and upskill L&D in this. We need to do the same with business leaders, right? We need to find channels. And I don't say this is just to vendors. I say this to L&D practitioners. It's what I try and do with Learning Tech Talks. We need to help the rest of the organization think differently about learning, because the reality is we all grew up in a classroom, right? We all went to school. It's what everyone's experienced. And so some of these things that to us in learning tech are just like, well, duh, who would say no to this? There are a lot of people that would say, well, that's different. That can't possibly be better. Just like before the COVID thing, there were a lot of people that said working from home can't work. And it's like, well, it can if done well. And I think this is one that vendors can continue to help, is how do we raise the tide for everyone?
Awesome. Let's assume that everyone right now is shaking their heads. Everyone listening has agreed with everything that we've said, because, brilliant people. Where should they start? So when it comes to taking these ideas back into their organization, looking at their learning technology and figuring out how do they close gaps or expand and improve their ecosystem, where do you start?
I think one of the biggest things that it's tough, because it goes against kind of our corporate mentality, which is we need to move slow to move fast. I don't see us a lot of times, and myself included, I've learned this over the years. It wasn't something that, I came out of college and was like, oh, this is how it works. It was really doing that front end work, right? I can't tell you how many organizations, they don't have an inventory of what are we doing today? What is the stuff that's critical? What is the stuff, that isn't critical? What are the real pain points that are happening in the organization? How is work actually being done in our organizations? And sometimes, we're so caught up in that, well, we don't have time to do that because look at all these other things that we have to do. And it's really about how do you, one, get your leaders to support you in this, but how do you actually make it a priority for you and your teams to say, no, this isn't something we just put off and we'll deal with later. This is something we're intentional about, because you can't know where you need to move if you don't know where you are today. It's just impossible. So I think that's one of the biggest things. And I think sometimes that's where we fall into the trap of like, we just want to jump to the next thing instead of saying, are we even getting the most out of what we're doing today? And sometimes it takes a hard look in the mirror and being willing to say, there's a lot of junk we're doing that we probably could just stop. I laugh because, there's a story out there about, the CLO at Airbnb. He just turned off the LMS for 2 weeks to see what would happen, and nothing happened. Right. And so it was kind of one of those things. It was like, if we really look objectively at what we're doing, what are the things that we could just stop to give us the capacity to do some of this work we need to do, to then be able to move fast? Because once you know where you need to go, it's that much easier to move fast. But if you're still just making iterations, it's going to take forever.
Yeah, I agreed. And I think the other thing for me is separating kind of the mentality around how we do what we do or what we think is interesting and cool from the problems that our organization is facing. Sometimes they'll nicely line up, right? We'll have an interesting idea with a particularly cool technology, and it's going to help us solve the right problem that's a big priority for the people we're supporting. But there may be a lot of things out there that we're exploring, we think are interesting. We like to be creative. We like to come up with interesting solutions. We like technology and different types of content. That doesn't mean they're the right things to do. And I can count on many hands the number of times that I applied a solution because I thought it was a good idea, as opposed to it was the thing that was actually going to help someone solve a problem. And so many of those times, it was a much simpler solution would have done it for me. But I had to get clever for whatever reason it was, and then realized over time, there really isn't a reward for being the most clever person in the space. It's about
Sometimes don't we do that? Right? Like sometimes we build complexity into things, and it's like, why did we do that? Like, because it makes us feel like, look how clever we are with that.
And it's not to say you can't like things, right? You can't explore clever ideas and play with interesting technology. It's just we can't leap to that being the solution to the problem. And I always reference what Clark Quinn told me once, which is what's the least amount of work you can do to solve the problem?
Yeah.
And that just seems so simple, but oftentimes that's not the angle we take. And I do a lot of question-based learning as an example with organizations, and a lot of times people don't understand that sometimes you can help people change their habits and change their behavior just by challenging their knowledge and asking them to apply it sometimes, as opposed to having to build a robust course in order to get to the same place you were going anyway.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about right, we are creative. We have this unique desire to try different things, and that's a good thing. And I think we can't lose sight of that. I think that's one trend that I think we have to be careful of in our industry is we've moved to this, it's all about performance. And it's like, okay, that's good, but we need to balance that with, okay, but let's explore, let's create, let's do different things. And I've always had an incubator is kind of the thing that I've always kept in my organizations. It's not like a specific group of people, it's a mindset. It's like we're going to have incubator projects. It might just be a complete wild hair we're going to try out. It may tank, it may not. We may learn from it. We may learn it just completely failed, and whatever. We'll just count it up as a loss, and that's fine. And I think that's helped balance that creativity with practicality.
Great suggestion. We'll throw to Jackie one more time. Jackie, any outstanding questions we should get before we adjourn for today?
Sorry about the delay, guys. Just a little technical difficulty on my end. We've covered all of the questions. Thanks for making sure that all of them got covered from the attendees today.
Awesome. And thanks everyone for submitting your questions as we've chatted. One last question for today. How can people keep up? So we already talked about how quickly things change, how quickly technology evolves in our everyday lives, as it were. What do you think people should be doing to keep pace with the evolution, even if it's something that they can't immediately apply in their organizations?
So some of it is, obviously the natural plug is, right, listen to Learning Tech Talks. I don't do it for my own good. I do it for the good of other people, right? So I've got to do the plug because, hey, why not? And I did it because I think it was solving a problem, not because I thought it was really cool. But the other thing too that I tell a lot of people is get out of your box, right? Get out of your box and talk to people from other organizations. Like I have a diligent regimen of setting up time with people from other organizations who are solving similar problems to me and just talking to them. You're like, what are you doing? How is that working for you? I can't tell you how many pilots I've learned from that I was not even the company that ran it, right? Because it was like, my friend over here is doing it. I was integrated. I helped with the strategy. They ran it and I learned from the results. And I said, is this something even worth me investing in? Now that's not natural, right? Normally people are like, I'm so focused on my work. I'm so focused on here. And it actually takes tipping your head up and saying, I'm going to look I'm going to look beyond my horizon and pull other people in. And I think I've done that. It's been invaluable to my career, and I would recommend it to anybody.
Great recommendation to end on. So you've already done the plug that I was setting you up for nicely with that last question. Definitely check out Learning Tech Talks. What's the easiest way for us to find out when the next show is?
So I would say, if you follow me or connect with me, I tell everybody just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I always post about what's coming. I do have learningsharks.com is where I keep that archive. So if people want to check it out, you can go there and just check out learningsharks.com. I've got every video in a searchable database that you can pull this stuff up. But yeah, I multi-stream it, so you can usually find it pretty much anywhere. But LinkedIn is where I do most of the communications.
Awesome. Also, I'm subscribed to you on YouTube and podcasts, so I can.
Oh, there you go. That way you can listen to it, you can watch it.
So many different ways.
So many different ways.
One additional plug for more information on topics like learning technologies and other things that we do at Axonify, head over to axonify.com/take5. Subscribe to our monthly newsletter with monthly video messages from myself, again, on a variety of different workplace learning topics. And if you have any additional questions, want to follow up with either of us based on today's conversation, feel free to reach out via email. If you're curious about how any of these ideas specifically will work with or help solve problems in your organization, we're happy to continue the conversation. But we're out of time. So again, thank you everyone for hanging out with us today for the last hour. Thank you for everything that you're doing right now, to help your organizations, to help your friends and family, to help our communities in general. So thank you, sir, for being our guest today. And I'd just like to say to everyone again, thank you, be well, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, stay healthy, everybody. All right.